You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record.
Hello, everybody. How you doing? Our guest has just arrived, just in time. Perfect timing. Hold on.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you. You're on the air. I just started a little bit early, so you didn't have to sit through the introduction and everything. But my guest, Andrew Hammel, is an inactive lawyer, translator, and journalist living in Dusseldorf, Germany. His piece, entitled The Wrongful Conviction of Adnan Syed, appeared in Quillette last month. It's an exhaustive examination of the evidence against Hae Min Lee's killer, Adnan Syed, and that's the topic of today's show. Welcome, Andrew Hammel.
Thanks very much. I would just like to note it's wrongful exoneration.
What did I say? Wrongful conviction?
Wrongful
exoneration. I'm sorry. Wrongful exoneration. I'm sorry. I deal with so many of these wrongful conviction cases.
Understandable.
Yeah. So my first question is, why did you choose Quillette, and did they have any influence in what you wrote in this piece?
Well, that's actually why I chose them, because they have, they're very good to their authors. They pay relatively well, and they give you a lot of autonomy. I guess the main reason I chose, I think they pronounce it Quillette, but I'm not the authority there. I actually know one of the editors there, a guy named Jamie Palmer, who's kind of a friend, or kind of acquaintance friend of mine. I've written for them before on completely unrelated topics. And I really enjoyed the experience because there's no word limit, and there's no intrusion into what you're writing. There's good editorial input, and they definitely care about accuracy. And also they're willing to publish articles that go against the grain. And in fact, they sort of pride themselves on that, being a little bit contrarian and putting forward alternative perspectives. And also, I mean, no mainstream outlet is going to publish 24,000 words on anything.
Oh, that's interesting. So the length was an issue, you think, with getting I don't know this. Do publishers want your piece really small? Do they?
Yeah, they're always cutting. They always insist on maybe like 5,000 words would be the very longest. The New Yorker is renowned for publishing really long pieces, but that's 11 or 12,000 words. And in fact, I didn't even plan for this article to be that long. I just thought it was going to be a normal, like 4,000 word essay. But then I just found out there's so much interesting stuff going on in this case, and it had so many implications, that, I begged for more time. It took like 3 times as long as I thought. And it eventually was at 40,000 words. And then me and Jamie Palmer, we just ruthlessly cut it down to the very bare minimum. But I thought, people needed to really get a grasp of the facts, because all you hear are snippets and excerpts and sound bites, and that doesn't convey the picture of the case.
Why did you entitle your piece The Wrongful Exoneration of Adnan Syed? How was Adnan Syed's how was he exonerated of the murder of Hae Min Lee, and why did you call it wrongful?
I called it wrongful exoneration, kind of as a play on wrongful conviction, of course. And the main reason I thought it was wrongful is that basically his exoneration was a political ploy. The courts of Maryland had analyzed his case exhaustively. He went all the way up and lost at the very final instance definitively by a 4-3 vote. And that was it. Everyone realized his appeals are over. He's just going to have to serve out his time. And then suddenly in September of 2022, out of the blue, with no warning to anybody, the prosecutor in Baltimore suddenly reverses course 180 degrees and uses a sort of public defender with a very sort of crusading mentality, who joined the prosecutor's office, just like 1 year before. and then stages a hearing in which no new evidence is put forward and no witnesses are heard, and there is no serious explanation for why this conviction has to be overturned. And of course, the family of Hae Min Lee, the victim, they were given ridiculously short notice, even though the prosecutor's office had been investigating the case, they say, for a year. And I was among lots of other people in September 2022 saying this proceeding is a farce. I mean, it's ridiculous. Everybody has sort of gotten together on one side. There's no genuine adversarial trial here. There's nobody probing whether this new evidence really makes the case. And of course, in the meantime, the Baltimore Appeals Court has come to exactly the same conclusion and issued a blistering opinion in which they said the way this conviction was overturned was completely inappropriate and unfair to the victim's family, and not, and also just did not put forward a case why Adnan should be released.
Yeah, I talked to Steve Kelly, the Lee's lawyer, right after it happened, and it was just, if anyone's interested, it's called Hae Min Lee's Family Speaks. It was just listening to what had happened in that hearing was such a heartbreak. And why? But one of the interesting things about the opinion that frightened me after hearing from Steve Kelly was that they asserted that one day's notice, even if the victim's family is in California, that is enough time. Do you agree with that?
No,
Is that
and I don't think.
sufficient notice?
Yeah, I mean, the notice, there's no actual law in Maryland saying exactly how long the notice has to be, but it does have to be reasonable.
Right,
And
reasonable. Thank you. Sufficient, reasonable. Right. Thank you.
exactly, I mean, in any context, you would say that just one business day for somebody that the prosecution knew that he was lived across the country, and that it would be almost impossible for him to show up without giving more notice. And when he asked the court for only one more week of notice,
Mhm.
that's all he said. He said, "I just need one more." I think I recall that correctly. Just one more week,
Yes.
so I can be there in person. And they denied that. And so, the appeals court also said that was unreasonable. Victims have a right to be present at these hearings. It's not exactly sure how many other rights they have. And if they want to be present there in person, then you need to give them enough lead time so that they can come. Because after all, what's happening here is, after 20 years of defending Adnan's conviction and telling the Lee family we have it all under control and we're going to win, the trial was fair, they suddenly reverse course 180 degrees and give the victim's family only one business day's worth of notice that they're doing so. I mean, it's looked suspicious, frankly. I mean, to a lot of people, that this was kind of like a setup job. They wanted to hurry and get it over with without having, young Lee come and make a lot of trouble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. So, what is the most clear and convincing evidence against Adnan Syed?
I would say first we go to the classic trinity of motive, means, and opportunity. They're not formal legal requirements, but they're important, and they're here in this case. The motive is as common as a summer sun shower. It is male sexual jealousy. So Adnan was dumped by his girlfriend Hae Min Lee, and he was angry about this. He was upset, and when he read a letter from her comforting him for and saying you'll get over it, he wrote, "I'm going to kill" on the back of that letter. And his own friends say that his face was flushed and his eyes were watery from pure, from male jealous rage. That she had now gone on to have, she'd not just dumped him, but she had gone on to start dating and also sleeping with a romantic rival of Adnan Syed. And that is a classic motive. Means, we've got multiple friends of Adnan, people who are not hostile to him, who testify that he asked Hae Min Lee for a ride to get into her car on January 13th, 1999, after school at around 2:15 p.m., which is something that they did even after they'd broken up, because Adnan publicly to the rest of the world was trying to put a brave face on things and say it didn't really matter. I was okay with the breakup. Privately, that was completely different. But so he used this opportunity The logical inference is he got into her car alone with her, and within about an hour she was dead. And so that is the last interaction, was him asking her for a ride. Nobody saw him actually get into the car, but it's clear that something like that occurred. And then opportunity. So we've got opportunity and then means. Adnan was 6 feet tall, still is, a basketball player, a track star, very athletic. So was Hae, but Hae was much smaller than Adnan. And so basically, her head was slammed into the side of the car, possibly enough to stun her or knock her unconscious. And then she was personally strangled to death by somebody who was very strong, and kept squeezing her throat for 2 or 3 minutes to choke the life out of her. And that's a classic way of a classic means of male sex crimes, because it's very personal, it's very intimate, it's very rage driven. And then you have the testimony of Jay Wilds, Adnan's friend, who had he testified under oath that Adnan popped the trunk of Hae Min Lee's car. So after Adnan kills Hae, he drives around in her car, and he gets together with his friend Jay Wilds and pops the trunk of Hae Min Lee's car, and Jay Wilds sees Hae Min Lee's body in the trunk of her own car, which is being driven by Adnan. And then Jay Wilds testifies that he helped Adnan bury Hae Min Lee in Leakin Park in Baltimore later that same evening. And when Jay Wilds talked to the police, both he and another witness called Jin Pusateri, when they said these things to police, they both implicated themselves in the cover-up of Hae Min Lee's murder. And if it turned out that Adnan had an alibi, that everyone had seen him at school, and there was no chance he had anything to do with the crime, Jay Wilds and Jin Pusateri would have become prime suspects in a murder. And so at the time they talked to police, they had to be absolutely certain that Adnan had no alibi. And in fact, he didn't. And they knew it, because they knew that he had no alibi, because Jay helped him cover up this crime. And so that's, it's really the tip of the iceberg, but that's more than enough to justify the jury's verdict. The jury took only 2 hours, and they were contacted afterward. And every juror who was contacted said this was a clear-cut, open and shut case. We had no problem finding Adnan guilty.
That's a very good summation of the evidence against Adnan Syed. What do you make of Jay Wilds saying that Adnan told him, I killed her with my own bare hand, or my own 2 hands, and that Jay has said he wore red gloves, and red fibers were found on Hae's body. Do you believe those things?
I believe those parts of Jay's testimony. I mean, obviously, Jay is a compromised witness. He has changed his story many times. As I point out in the article, that is not at all uncommon. But he changed them even more times than many witnesses. But, to me, the overall account that he gives at trial, and also afterward in his Intercept interview, that has the ring of truth. And I can see that happening. And also, that also explains if Adnan was wearing these they were like red gloves with leather on the inside and fabric on the back. And that's what Jay testified to. And red fibers were found in Hae Min Lee's hair, that they couldn't be definitive. They couldn't be matched to the gloves because Adnan got rid of the gloves. But obviously, Adnan was somebody who understood DNA and didn't want to leave his own DNA directly on Hae's body. And there was also evidence inside Hae's car that was suggestive. It wasn't conclusive. Like, for instance, there was a map of Baltimore. Back then, we had to use books for maps. And so there's a map of Baltimore in Hae Min Lee's car, and the page for Leakin Park, where she was buried, was torn out of that map book. And the back of the map book had Adnan's left palm print on it. And also Adnan testified that during Hae Min Lee's death struggle, when he was strangling her, her body jerked, or she moved and broke like a little lever on the side of the steering column. And in fact, there was a broken lever on the side of the steering column in the car. And Adnan's fingerprints were found on some floral paper in the trunk of Hae Min Lee's car. And so all of these things, these are not conclusive because there's no question that Adnan was often in Hae's car, but they're also suggestive. They are consistent with his crime, being the culprit, and they fit as pieces of a mosaic into the overall mosaic of evidence that points toward Adnan.
You also talk about some really interesting things that were discovered in Adnan's car that made the police think he might be fleeing. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, they found when they searched his car, I think this is sometime in March, they found a little packet with 2 passport photos. And this is important because Adnan at the time had an expired Pakistani passport. And so if you'd wanted to renew his Pakistani passport, Adnan was an American citizen. He was born in the USA, but he also had Pakistani citizenship and a passport. And so it's, nobody went into this in very great depth, but, if you were going to renew your Pakistani passport and flee back to the home country where Adnan's family still had a lot of ties, what you would need is fresh, updated passport photos. This was all hashed out a lot during Adnan's bail hearings because, during the bail hearings, Adnan's attorney said, well, he's got all this support from the community, the Baltimore Muslim community here. And the prosecution said, well, actually, he's also got lots and lots of family members back in Pakistan. And Pakistan does not have an extradition treaty with the United States. So this is one reason you should keep him in prison, in jail. But, of course, murderers very rarely get bail anyway. So it's suggestive. And also just at that time, right before Adnan's trial, there was a really famous case involving an Israeli who committed a murder in the United States. I think his name was Ira Einhorn. And then he fled to Israel, which also doesn't extradite its citizens for crimes. And so the prosecution mentioned that. She later said she might have gone a little bit overboard with that. But yeah, he had an expired passport and fresh photos in his car. And there was no evidence at all that he was, his family were planning a trip to Pakistan.
Just an interesting thing for my audience about Ira Einhorn. He comes up in so many cases, in this one and also in the NXIVM case. He was supported by the Bronfman family, and of course Claire Bronfman being one of the NXIVM defendants. She's currently doing a 7-year prison sentence. So why is Jay's changing story heavily criticized and Adnan's amnesia in changing story about asking Hae Min Lee for a ride not criticized?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I mean, Jay's stories did change, and he explained at length why he changed his stories. So for instance, he changed his story about where the trunk pop occurred, where Adnan opened the trunk and showed him Hae Min Lee's body. At first, he said it happened on Edmondson Avenue, and then somewhere else, and then in before Best Buy. He also changed his story about what he and Adnan were doing on the afternoon of the offense. After around 5 p.m., that's when Jay Wilde's story lines up with other witness testimony very well and is also confirmed by cell phone evidence. And so I think, and is it relevant that he changed his story? Does that diminish his credibility? The answer is absolutely, of course. But, if you ask any prosecutor or any criminal lawyer on either side, the classic thing that prosecutors tell juries when they are making their case is, we don't get to seek out the witnesses we put on the witness stand. They come to us, warts and all. And, they are often, if they're involved in the crime, they have a lot to hide, and they will always initially try to deny involvement as much as possible, and then gradually give more things up. And, Jay was questioned about that on the witness stand. He said, I changed my story because I wanted to keep my friends out of the crosshairs of the police. And I wanted to keep my grandmother, where I was living, I wanted to keep her out of the crosshairs of the police. And my other family members, who some of them were big time drug dealers. I didn't want the police coming anywhere near them. So I kept making up different bits of this, changing the locations where certain events happened to try to deflect attention, first of all, to try to minimize my own involvement, and to deflect attention from my stoner friends. All of the witnesses in this case smoked a lot of marijuana all the time, including Jay. And they, several of them have now a criminal record for that. So the last thing he wanted to do is say, Adnan showed me the dead body of Hae Min Lee right in front of the house of one of my stoner friends who probably has 2 pounds of marijuana in her back bedroom. And so, if you especially his Intercept interview, I think he comes across as, as pretty honest. He shaved the truth and misled the police and tried to deny involvement. And as Daryl Massey, the veteran Baltimore homicide detective, and Ann Benaroya of the, Jay's lawyer, a veteran public defender, said, this happens all the time. It's totally normal. Now, when it comes to Adnan, Adnan's gave multiple conflicting statements about exactly what he was doing just before Hae Min Lee left school, and conflicting statements about whether he asked her for a ride and why he asked her for a ride. And these, these things are lies about exactly what his intentions and motivations and actions were directly before he left campus, probably with Hae Min Lee in her car. And but nobody seems to care about that. They just gloss it over. Sarah Koenig in Serial just barely paid any attention to that. And if you ask him at all, he just attributes it to some sort of memory loss or getting confused or I didn't understand it. But that's completely false, because he knew he was being, he knew he was a prime, not a prime suspect, but a serious suspect from the very day Hae disappeared, January 13th, 1999. There was no way that he didn't understand that his answers to police were extremely important.
Yeah, you have a great quote in there from a police officer, I believe, talking about confessions in Baltimore. I can't, it's like, we're used to them being mostly untrue. The first one is mostly untrue. I think, is that something like that?
Yeah, exactly. He said culturally in Baltimore, the first statement is always going to be a lie. And then you just get closer and closer to the truth. That's Daryl Massey, who actually was a star in The Wire by David Simon.
Oh, interesting. So you write Serial aims to answer 3 questions. Why can't Adnan remember the events of January 13th, 1999? Could the trip from Woodland High to Best Buy be accomplished in 21 minutes? And 3, what might Asia have said as an alibi had she been given the opportunity to testify? Do you think that those 3 questions are the right questions to ask if you were making a podcast like Serial? And what were the questions you would have asked been?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would say, first of all, yeah, I don't think those were the right questions, because most of those questions rely on assuming that Adnan and Asia are telling the truth. And so Adnan says, well, I couldn't remember anything. And so then Serial simply sort of accepts that. Sarah Koenig says, oh, it's really such a shame that Adnan can't remember what happened on January the 19th. My question would have been, is Adnan telling the truth when he says he couldn't remember that day? Because the credibility of your prime source and protagonist has to be the highest priority. And the same thing with Asia. She goes, Sarah Koenig talks to Asia and says, how did this come about? When did you give the affidavit? When did you meet him? What did you see? Where were you at the library? The more fundamental question is Asia's testimony truthful and relevant? And what are the indications that and even if it is true, what does it even prove? And so Sarah Koenig, I think proper journalism would have been, first of all, asking whether these people are telling the truth. What does the evidence indicate about whether they're telling the truth and whether their memory is accurate? And only then, if you establish, hey, Adnan really, can't remember it, or however you would prove that, then you go on. But Sarah Koenig assumed that people who had an agenda didn't. And she assumed that people who frankly, we're lying to her. We're telling the truth. So I think there's a little bit of naivete going on there.
Is that naivete, or is it bias to present to present the Adnan, or an incentive to keep the listeners being doubtful about Adnan Syed's guilt? Because if he's guilty, there's not much of a podcast, right?
Exactly. I mean, nobody's going to be very interested in that. And also, as I've pointed out, a couple times in the article, and I've also asked Sarah Koenig for comment about a lot of these things, and she has not gotten back to me. She has declined to respond to any of my comments. I would say it's a mixture of naivete and then also wanting to build a good, flashy true crime narrative and keep the whodunit going. And I'm also going to say sloppy journalism, because as I show in the pieces, we now can read the defense file that Adnan's lawyers put together, which is pretty amazing. And Sarah Koenig told her listeners that we combed through the entire defense file and looked for anything that might cast doubt on Adnan's credibility or shed light on the case. And either she did that and didn't find very important stuff, or she found the very important stuff and didn't tell her viewers. And the most blatant, incredibly blatant example is in episode 2 of Serial. Adnan says over the telephone that I would never have gone to the Best Buy parking lot after school with Hae Min Lee because she always drove directly to pick up her cousins or nephews from daycare. So she leaves school at 2:15 p.m., drives directly to daycare at 3 p.m. We would never have gotten together. We never did anything after school because she immediately always drove right there. And that's what he told 300 million listeners. And that's what Sarah Koenig let him tell them. And in the defense files, there's a memo from October 6, 1999, Adnan talking to his own lawyers, where he has no motive to lie at all, and no hostility and no cross-questioning. And he says, "Oh yeah, me and Hae Min Lee, we drove to the Best Buy parking lot after school and had sex there 6 or 7 times a week." Because it only took took like 8-10 minutes to get to the Best Buy. We had 20 minutes to have sex. And then she could easily drive to the Camp Field Early Learning Center and pick up her nephews. And so, I asked Sarah Koenig. I couldn't ask her. She's not on social media. But I asked Ira Glass, the producer. This is a glaring problem with Serial. And this is a huge issue. And really, I am happy, and I invite you to please come and tell me whether Sarah Koenig saw this memo, and if so, why didn't she tell her listeners about it? And I've gotten absolutely nothing. There's been a stone wall of silence. Everyone is shut down. They're afraid of the Streisand effect, probably. So,
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that, I sort of am somewhat sympathetic to Sarah Koenig, but I think that Serial has been shown to be a very, very flawed piece of journalism, and that created a false picture of the case that persists to this day.
What is your interpretation of Adnan's October 10th, 2013 letter to Sarah Koenig, in which he writes, Justin Brown, quote, mentioned in his letter that you stated you would not do this story unless you believed I was innocent, unquote?
I mean, that is the definition of a red flag. I mean, no journalist should ever take on a project in which they're supposedly supposed to prove somebody's innocence before they've even looked into the facts. And so that's, one red flag, which I think Sarah Koenig should have immediately pushed back and said, I'm not going to do this project under these conditions. And she should have also been suspicious of Adnan and of Justin Brown and of Rabia Chaudhry, that they were pushing an agenda because of this. And she should have pushed back and maintained her journalistic, independence. And the second huge red flag is that I think both in Adnan's letter, but also Rabia Chaudhry told Sarah Koenig, I think Adnan's defense attorney, Cristina Gutierrez, intentionally lost Adnan's trial so that she could get money to do an appeal. And then she wanted like $50,000 to do an appeal. So she intentionally botched the case and lost the trial in order to get more money for an appeal. First of all, this is a lie, and Rabia Chaudhry knew it, because on March 1st of 2000, Rabia Chaudhry wrote a memo to the supporters of the community in which Rabia Chaudhry herself said, I talked to Cristina Gutierrez about her doing the appeal in Adnan's case, and Cristina said, that is not usually the right thing to do. You should get a new lawyer, which is the right advice. That's good advice. And so Rabia knew. Cristina Gutierrez had told Rabia, you should get a new lawyer for the appeal. Rabia had written this in a memo that she posted, that she used it in her own 2016 book. And, so first of all, Rabia is being deceptive about this. I think that's a clear lie. I've asked Rabia for comment. She's also not responded. And Sarah Koenig should have said, hold on, accusing a lawyer of deliberately losing a trial where the guy gets a life sentence. That's like accusing a doctor of poisoning a patient in order to keep generating medical bills. That is the worst kind of professional malfeasance ever. And you must provide me with proof of this. Otherwise, I'm not going for it, because that is a crazy accusation. It is. It's a crazy accusation. So that, Sarah Koenig was either ignorant or, frankly, willfully and culpably naive and neglectful, because that accusation was another gigantic red flag.
Yeah, she also accused, as you point out in your piece, Kevin Urich of being corrupt. I'm not sure if that's exactly out of her mouth, but she trash talks him all over town. Also, gosh, I mean, she's also accused the police of framing Adnan and giving Jay the where the car is, that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
With the information. So I mean, she's accused multiple people of doing really serious crimes, and she seems immune to criticism. Is it that everyone's afraid of her?
I really, yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, some people definitely are afraid of her, because, she called Kevin Urich, the prosecutor of Adnan Syed, she called him Satan, a dirty prosecutor, a mother effer, and she prays every day with her head on the floor for him to roast in hell forever. And so, if you get on her bad side, she has got a lot of ammunition, and she uses it. And also, the errors, I pointed out just two instances of what I consider to be deception, or, extremely misleading commentary by Rabia Chaudhry, and they're still up there on the internet. She hasn't even bothered to remove them. She hasn't tried to actually defend her, these errors and these misleading statements. She just really doesn't seem to care whether what she says is accurate or not, as long as it serves her agenda. And I think another thing that's going on here is that, Rabia is intelligent. She's, articulate. She certainly has a lot of media savvy. She can give great sound bites and interviews. She has a great voice too for radio. And she's also a minority, a Muslim woman, a proud Muslim woman who's, raising a family and got a law degree in the United States. So she's certainly achieved a lot in her life and has brought a lot of attention to Adnan's case and other people's cases. And also, I think that probably interacting personally with her is pleasurable, as long as you're on her good side, and as long as you don't question what she has to say. And you can hear this actually in the podcast that she did with Colin Miller and Susan Simpson, the Undisclosed podcast. As long as they are endorsing Adnan's perspective, then, she's fine. But anyone else who questions Adnan's perspective, she goes on a warpath. So I think, there's a sort of politically correct tendency to have sympathy for her, because, she does come from a marginalized minority community and has definitely made a great success of her life here, and all of that. But also, everybody knows that if you get on her bad side, she will cut off contact and, denounce you And if you're a journalist, you'll try to poison the waters by telling sources not to cooperate with you. That is my opinion. I think that's certainly what's going on in the background.
Why did you describe Robbie as a true believer?
Because first of all, I mean, she's left all of these misleading statements up, even though she's been caught in misleading statements many times. She's never corrected any of them. And so, either she can't, either she doesn't care whether what she says is accurate or not. And I think that is the case in many of these instances. Or she's just so locked into a filter bubble of believing people are innocent, certainly believing Adnan is innocent. She's completely committed to the idea that Adnan is innocent and will not acknowledge any contrary evidence at all. And she's also gone on to, comment on other true crime cases. And she almost always takes the position, takes the part of the alleged victim of a miscarriage of justice. And so I think, and she gets a lot of support from, law professors and activists who also share that worldview. So with respect to Adnan, she described him as like my little brother. And her own brother, Syed Chaudhry, is Adnan's best friend, or was at the time of the crime. So she has no objectivity whatsoever about Adnan. She admits she has no objectivity whatsoever about Adnan, which is once again a very good reason for journalists to question everything she says.
Okay, we'll circle back to Robbie in a bit, but why you wrote that Serial wasn't an advocacy piece for Adnan? Why not?
Well, because she did. I mean, what I'm really contrasting Serial with is the later media stuff, like crime writers on Serial and Undisclosed, and especially the 2019 HBO documentary. I have to put scare quotes around it because the 2019 documentary about Adnan's case, the case against Adnan Syed, which was a blatant piece of propaganda, nothing more. It had nothing to do with journalism. But Serial at least explored, at least allowed people who thought that, for instance, they hired a Washington, D.C. homicide detective, Jim Trainum, to review the case, and they allowed him to say in Serial that this was a good investigation. They documented the evidence, and the fact that Jay Wilds knew where Hae Lee's car had been deposited is a huge fact, pointing to the fact that Jay was telling the truth about that part of the story and that Adnan is guilty. And also one of the producers of Serial, Dana Chivis, they allowed her to go in broadcast, during the broadcast, and say, listen, there's so much evidence pointing against Adnan that you would have to believe he's the unluckiest man on earth for him to be innocent of this crime. And so at least they were willing to give people who believed in the power of circumstantial evidence the chance to at least say their piece. And also, if you look on Reddit and lots of other places, but especially Reddit, which I think is a pretty important and reliable source, you'll find that about half of the people who listened to Serial came away thinking Adnan was guilty.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the reasons that, although I think Serial is deeply flawed, I don't think Sarah Koenig was interested in just doing a snow job or pro-Adnan propaganda. Amy J. Berg, the director of the case against Adnan Syed, she was interested in a snow job and pure propaganda. I mean, I would really love to discuss this with Sarah Koenig. I mean, I've tried to be, moderate and fact-based in my critiques and fair. And I'd love to talk to her about her approach to this and what she thinks of the evidence that came out later. But alas, she just will not engage on this issue. Neither will Ira Glass.
That's just why I think that they know Adnan is guilty, is because, I noticed in your blog post about, is it Jen Soaring? Is that how you pronounce it? I have a really way with messing up names.
It's Yins.
Yins. Okay, of course.
Yeah.
Well, I'm right. I'm consistent, at least. Consistently messing up names. That you say, well, Amanda Knox, who's advocated for him. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Amanda Knox, who's advocated for him, and Jason Flom, and I think you include John Grisham in that list. Those are
Yeah.
all advocates for him. I've invited them to come tell me where I'm wrong. And my experience, I've been looking at cases of wrongful convictions and exploring what I think is the real evidence in those cases for 5 years. I have not had one, well, not once has anyone ever agreed to come on and have a discussion. And that's a big difference I see in the sort of the more this side of things, the more reasonable side of things, and this kind of blind advocacy, because I feel it's connected to an ideology that even if they are guilty, they're still the little person being held down by the man, meaning our system is so fundamentally flawed. And so they're a victim of the system. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that is definitely a part of the ideology because I'm a former criminal defense lawyer, and most of my fellow former and current criminal defense lawyers believe in one or another form of that ideology because it helps them do their job. And so, they approach the state's case with a maximum of skepticism, and they always have the beginning of their, you always think this is one person and I'm one lawyer and I'm up against, three prosecutors and a lot of experts. And so identifying with the underdog is a good thing. It has a lot of positive repercussions in society. Many professions, including social workers, believe in the underdog, but it can become an all-encompassing ideology that you come to any fresh case even before you know the facts, and you think, well, the underdog is the defendant here because he's poor or he's a minority or he didn't have a fair chance in life, and then you strain and filter all the facts through that initial presumption, and that's what leads to a lot of these problems. Another thing in Germany, I began writing about the Jens Zering case in Germany because I speak fluent German and I live in Germany and I write for German newspapers. And the other thing, the dynamic is also what happens. Now, this is my opinion, but I think it's very much true here. Is what happens is some sympathetic criminal defendant with all of his activists and lawyers comes to a celebrity or some wealthy person like Peter Jackson or Jason Flom,
Mhm.
or some activists, and says, here's this guy who really got screwed, and here's all the evidence showing he got screwed. Go talk to him. And then they talk to the defendant in person or to the defendant's family members. And the defendant comes over, very sympathetic, very convincing. Then they do a one-sided investigation, produce a one-sided podcast or media report. And then what happens? And they aren't anticipating any blowback. They think, at the crest of the wrongful convictions movement, everyone's on our side. Nobody's going to try to pick apart any of this because everyone wants fairness for criminal defendants. And then along comes a skeptic who's well informed and does the research, and suddenly they're experiencing a sort of humiliating situation in which they realize they got suckered. And that defendant who was so earnest and honest was lying to them. And, that one-sided presentation from the defendant's attorney, turns out there was tons of evidence not mentioned there pointing toward the defendant's guilt. And it's so humiliating to have to admit that you have been taken in by a con man. And so instead of just coming out and saying, listen, I'm sorry, I got it wrong, this guy's claims are fraudulent, they just clam up and they hope it goes away. They put their heads in the sand. There's a great sort of exception to this rule, which is in my work on the Jens Zering case. One of Jens Zering's former supporters, this is a woman that I know personally who I've spoken to. She wrote lots of stuff for him and maintained his website. She was right that, she had almost daily contact with him. And after she read my work on the case, which was, fact-based and responsible and solid, she realized, oh my God, I was taken in. And what she did, the honorable thing, she came forward and she said, listen, I was his one of his top 5 supporters for years, but now I recognize that I was taken in and that what he was telling me was not true, and that he actually is guilty of murdering these two people. And I helped him make his case for years. I regret that. I'm sorry about that. And I want to come out and correct the record. She did that in Germany and got a whole lot of, hatred and abuse. And Yin Zuring, went after her and tried to get her fired from her job. But she had the courage to come forward and put herself out there and say what she knew. And I'm hoping that happens with these cases.
See, I've had a few people on who've been advocates, but they're always smaller advocates. Like for Adnan Syed, one of the was a big supporter I had on, and she had come to the conclusion he was guilty. Also, Darlie Routier, same thing. And they hate those people because you can't say that they're biased, and that's their favorite thing to say about someone like me or someone else who think they're guilty pretty much pretty close to the beginning of the phenomenon, whatever phenomenon is created by this media for these killers. But Mike, so I question whether people at the top are really believe in these people's innocence, because if I really believed in someone's innocence, you couldn't stop me from going on any show, no matter how small, if someone I thought was wrongfully convicted in prison, and debating the critics, debating everyone, going up against the toughest people. I would love it. I would never stop talking about an injustice. But why doesn't this ideology see the victim as the man, as the little man, as the, you know what I mean, the underdog up against the man?
Yeah, exactly.
Why is the victim so forgotten in the victim's family? And why is it when someone like, I'm very happy you pointed out Amy Berg, who directed what I'd call propaganda, with, what an Adnan Syed supporter would call a great documentary for Adnan Syed, right? The case against Adnan Syed. She said something about Hae Min Lee's brother, Young Lee, being like a used car salesman, or his lawyer being like a used car salesman, really dismissive of the family. Why is that go by? Why is that so acceptable to say, to demean the sort of victim's family and the people that represent them?
Yeah, and I think I don't think Amy Berg has been that critical of Young Lee herself, because she knows that would, make a really horrible impression. And but she did criticize his lawyer, Steve Kelly, the used car salesman who, got a gigantic victory in the Maryland Court of Appeals. The entire law firm got the victory, but Steve Kelly was the first one on it. And I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. First of all, there's this sort of idea that, well, it's the job of the criminal justice system to take care of the victims and to get justice for the victims. And so, it's the job of the criminal justice system to prove the defendant was guilty and put him in prison. And so that's not our job as crusading journalists or activists to take up the cause of the victim, because the victim has theoretically already been represented by the state. And, as Americans say, we live in a nation of laws, not men. And so the state takes care of these things. And so and also victims' family members, I mean, to put it frankly, they usually don't have much new factual information to contribute, except for obviously their horrible, wrenching, painful loss. But the defendants' lawyers always have new theories and always have new stories, etc. But I think, and you see with Amy J. Berg, especially in that documentary about Adnan Syed, she's sort of halfway, they always sort of halfway try to say, oh, we care about the victim's family and we're sympathetic toward them, but look at all of this evidence and look at all these miscarriages of justice. And I can say, as a former criminal defense lawyer for death row inmates, interacting with the victim's family is always a very, very delicate thing. And, we would never do that directly as lawyers, but we would reach out to people who knew the victims' families. But I would say, if you're going to do a documentary about Adnan Syed's case, I also think that, Sarah Koenig should have reached out to the Lee family and asked for their perspective and put more, because, Hae Min Lee is now dead and gone. And the entire course of her life that could have unfolded and developed was brutally cut short by a man who is quite obviously guilty. And I think that perspective always needs to be integrated into, if you're going to say the guy might be innocent, sure, fine. But you should always make sure that the audience knows there's a lot of evidence against this person and that the victim's family suffers every single day with this horrible, grievous loss. And unless you can put forward an absolutely solid case that the wrong man's in prison, then you have to respect the fact that the victim's family is going to have a lot of hostility and resentment toward this person for the best reasons imaginable.
Mhm. You write that this is groupthink among journalists, but as you've probably heard me bring up before, Ken Silverstein, who did two pieces with Natasha Vargas, did pieces with Natasha Vargas Cooper, interviews with Kevin Urich and Jay Wilds. He was working at the Intercept at that time, and he describes in his piece that was published February 27th, 2015. It's called The Intercept, Where Journalism Goes to Die. He describes a whole being harassed, I think Jeremy Scahill threatened to quit over it, one other journalist there, over their interviewing Jay Wilds and Kevin Urich and not having a pro Adnan bent to their articles. And he writes, quote, "I came to realize that the system working correctly and the right people going to jail isn't a good narrative to tell at the Intercept." So we started this interview talking about finding a home for your excellent exploration of the evidence against Adnan Syed in Quillette. Is there a lot of places you can go if you want to express this kind of guilty person, or this person is guilty, or go up against some of this wrongful conviction entertainment, I'd call it?
It's really difficult. And so, I've read those Ken Silverstein pieces too, and they were great. Somebody coming in, putting the Team Adnan sticker on his door. And that's exactly the dynamic that happens. It becomes this like convenient soundbite media narrative that all of the right thinking people have to endorse. Like for the West Memphis Three, these guys were only targeted because they wore Metallica t-shirts and had weird haircuts. And all of you celebrities, you were like that too, and now you're famous. Come on board. And then, among certain kinds of people who tend to just go along with the flow, especially journalists have a herd mentality, frankly, more than many other professions. And so I thought that was a great piece by Ken Silverstein showing that this groupthink takes effect. And also, there's this automatic bias among almost all journalists, and they will often come out and say, quite openly that this is the case. We are here to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. We're here to expose injustices to the underdog and expose wrongdoing among the rich and powerful, which, that's okay as far as it goes, but that's not that's not a mature and responsible and all sides, and sort of comprehensive way of looking at the world. And you see this kind of journalistic groupthink all over the place. I mean, journalists will just go somewhere where some injustice has happened, and they'll interview activists and defense lawyers or plaintiffs' lawyers. And then they'll give a routine 5 or 10 minutes to people on the prosecution side or people who are speaking for companies because they think this is what they have to do. This is what's, but I've actually had some success in Germany where the phenomenon is exactly the same way. When I first published my pieces about Jens Zuring, everybody said, who is this weird crank? We don't know anything about him. Oh, he's an American, so he must be a rah patriot. But, I put a lot of work into the pieces and made them good. And now the entire dialogue has shifted, and a lot of German journalists are questioning their approach to cases like this. and questioning the idea of always looking for the underdog. So I think it's just an ingrained bias among journalists when they're educated and when they go to college and when they start reporting, and especially actually journalists who've gone to college and journalism schools that are famous, prominent, and important, like Columbia or Chicago. Small town journalists like Gary Meese of the West Memphis Three
friend of
fame.
mine. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He didn't have any of that ideology pumped into him. He's just a smart, careful, thorough journalist who knows all about this stuff.
Yeah.
And he based his opinion on what the evidence showed in the case. But when you come from like a sort of journalism school, and your professors are always telling you, defend the underdog, question the system, be critical toward institutions, then they're teaching you to have an ingrained bias toward every story you pick up, which isn't the right way to do journalism.
But I just wonder if I know how hard it is for me having this point of view, doing this podcast, and the way I'm treated by other journalists in court. So not welcoming.
Of course, yeah, I can imagine.
Definitely. So you actually wrote a really excellent 10 Commandments for journalists. It's really aimed at Germany, since the 10th one is directly talks about German cases. But you bring up some interesting points. Thou shalt not never forget that a trial has taken place. Thou shalt read the previous court's decisions and take the judge's work seriously. Thou shalt not believe everything a prisoner says. Thou shalt not believe everything a defense lawyer says. Thou shalt report honestly and transparently about the motives of the real people you're reporting on and the conditions under which you are reporting. 6, thou shalt understand the role of the actors in an American court case. I'm almost to the end. Thou shalt use common sense. Thou shalt acknowledge that not all trial errors are important. Thou shalt not ignore demographics and social cultural realities. And the 10th is dealing with German cases. So how well do you think Serial followed your 10 Commandments?
Not very well, very poorly, in fact, because first of all, if you look at Serial and the case against Adnan Syed, they almost ignore the trial. I mean, they mine the trial for some sound bites, but that's about it. As I pointed out in the Quillette pieces, the first time that Serial gets around to actually describing the evidence that convinced 12 jurors to convict him in 2 hours comes in episode 6. I mean, that's just not right. The episode, and also Serial completely ignores all of the judicial decisions that happened up until that time, and the decisions and the hearings, or they mention them with 1 or 2 sentences. I mean, we pay judges for a reason. We give them the power that they have for a reason. You should take what they do seriously. And also, obviously, Sarah Koenig did not consider the biases and prejudices and motivations of Rabia Chaudhry, who was her primary source of information for so much that happens in Serial. And, she should have been much more transparent. She should have certainly told her audience that when Adnan sent me the letter in 2013 asking me to take up his case, Adnan, said, "Don't do this unless you think I'm innocent." Sarah Koenig should have said, "I saw that and I rejected it. So I am not following his own particular motivations in this case. I'm doing completely independent work." And so, I think Serial violated certain of these. It's informal. That was, the editor and I worked that out, the 10 Commandments. But I still think they're pretty good. Now, when it comes to things like the case against Adnan Syed from HBO, that fails every one of those commandments. It's trash. It's trash.
So
so is west of Memphis.
Oh yeah, I agree with that. So you write so Actually, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So, what what is the evidence that got Adnan Syed released? I mean, what was this shocking new evidence that got Adnan released?
Yeah, sure. So on September 19th, 2022, during the hearing, the new prosecutor, who is a former defense attorney, Becky Feldman, she submitted what's called a motion to vacate the conviction, to overturn it. And so this motion to vacate, I think it's about like 20 pages long. Of course, I've read it, commented on it, etc. And I would say, as a lawyer, I'm no longer actively practicing. It's it's a pretty terrible piece of work, and it's been
Isn't
torn
it
apart.
weird? I think Erica Sutter's Innocence Clinic students wrote it. That's my theory on it. But I thought it was very weirdly written.
Yeah, and she even doesn't even get the name where Hae's car was deposited correct. She says it was Edgewood Avenue and then Edgewood's Road when it was Edgewood Street. But what she said was, first of all, she said Jay can't be Jay's testimony is not reliable because he changed his story a bunch of times. And then she says that one of the detectives in Adnan's case, William Ritz, was accused of misconduct in other cases. And then she says that we have discovered that, Hae Min Lee's car was parked for about a month and a half at a lot near Edgewood Street in Baltimore. And we've discovered that one of our new alternate suspects, one of their family members, owned property near that vacant lot. I'm not really sure what that should tell us. Then she says another one of the new alternate suspects was later convicted of sexual assault. And so she basically says and she also says that the cell phone tower evidence from Adnan's original trial was not reliable. And she then cites, I think probably this is the last one, that one of the witnesses in Adnan Syed's case later came forward in a 2019 HBO documentary and said she might have gotten the dates wrong when she testified in Adnan's trial. So it's a two-pronged strategy. First of all, cell tower evidence and Jay's testimony are not, have been weakened and are not all that credible. And then we have these two new suspects, and we have these vague accusations against the new suspects. And taking this all together, we think that Adnan should go free. And so it was just this mishmash of, relevant and irrelevant and exaggerated facts and activist claims. The two new suspects, by the way, are Bilal Ahmed, who is currently in federal prison. He did commit sexual assault against vulnerable victims, just as it was said in the motion to vacate. But those victims were young boys. He lured them into his dentist's practice.
And Hae Min Lee wasn't essayed. Excuse me, excuse me the abbreviation,
yeah,
but we're on YouTube.
There was no sign of
yeah,
sexual assault.
so right. So,
and then the other victim, the other alleged new, and also these new suspects have been known to the police for 24 years and have been cleared of any involvement in the crime long ago. The other one was a guy named Alonzo, the weird guy who went into the park to pee and found Hae Min Lee's body. And apparently because he was a weirdo streaker, and he is a weirdo streaker, and he's gone on to get involved in like small-time conflicts with women, nothing extremely serious. Yeah, but he's a bad dude, and he has broken the law, but there's certainly no indication that he is some kind of vicious sexual predator. And also, Hae Min Lee was not sexually assaulted. So if that was his MO, then he didn't use it. And there's absolutely zero evidence that Bilal or Alonzo are involved in this crime in Hae Min Lee's murder at all. Absolutely none. They're completely innocent of involvement in Hae Min Lee's murder, especially because Jay Wilds knew where Hae Min Lee's car was. So if Bilal or Alonzo somehow murdered Hae Min Lee, they had to do it with Jay Wilds' knowledge. which Jay Wilds, has never even indicated.
But
It's ludicrous. It's ludicrous. There's
Mhm.
nothing behind this motion to vacate, yet Adnan was freed based on it.
And my understanding is that Kevin Ure came out and said, "Oh no, it's an interview he did with Bilal's wife where she's saying he's harassing Hae Min Lee. And Bilal's wife was describing not Bilal but Adnan Syed. So one of the two new suspects is actually Adnan Syed himself that released Adnan Syed. It's so ludicrous and ridiculous."
Yeah, and when it comes to that, Kevin Urich, so as a lawyer, if you have a note, they say they found this note from, 22 years ago, a handwritten, undated note in Kevin Urich's own handwriting, which says that somebody threatened to get rid of Hae Min Lee, but it's not clear who that was. And the lawyers for Baltimore, Becky Feldman and Marilyn Mosby, they don't even submit this note into evidence. It's not, they don't even give it to the court. The judge, may not, the judge probably read it, but it wasn't put into the court for everyone to see. And so they say their interpretation of this note written by Kevin Urich is that Adnan Syed is threatening Hae Min Lee. And that's, shows that there was a cover up and a Brady violation. The prosecution didn't give this evidence. But, the first thing you learn in law school when you learn an evidence class is that if the contents of a note or a document are disputed and ambiguous, then a court cannot accept that as evidence unless you bring the people who wrote the note, the person who wrote the note, into court and have them testify under oath as to what it means. Because otherwise, the note is just pure hearsay, and there's no way to figure out what it means if it is ambiguous. And they didn't even do that. And that is like, evidence law 101. And so
Wow.
Kevin Urich reads this and says, this is completely absurd. I wrote that darned note. And so he leaks it. Marilyn Mosby is very angry that he leaked it, but he leaked it to correct the record and say, I was the one who took that conversation and took that phone call, and I know exactly what Bilal's ex-wife, or possibly his ex-wife's lawyer, it's not quite clear, but he said, I talked to them and I knew what this person was trying to convey. And to not even call him, they didn't even contact him, much less call him as a witness. That is, in my view, legal malpractice.
Yeah. Horrible, horrible. And why wasn't, before I ask this question, please share, subscribe to this channel. If you have questions for myself or Andrew Hammel, please ask via the super chats and I'll be getting to them at the end. So what was so bizarre was, why wasn't Jay Wilds' conviction vacated at the same time as Adnan Syed's? And if it's not, and if Adnan Syed's conviction eventually becomes vacated and his stays on the books, what does that mean?
That is actually a really interesting question that I hadn't thought about much before. But it actually came up on Reddit a few days ago. I'm sort of on Reddit about this case a lot. And that's it. I mean, it's an interesting legal question. I won't bore you with the details, but I would say that if, let's say, the Maryland Supreme Court decides to take the case and they say there's no problem with the hearing and Adnan's conviction is vacated and he's a free man and he's an innocent man. Well, now you have Jay Wilds, who has a felony conviction on his record for a crime which officially did not occur the way that he said it occurred at trial. And, I would think that if the Maryland Supreme Court eventually comes down in Adnan's favor, Jay should submit a petition to be completely cleared. He probably won't, because there's a lot of, there's a lot of complex legal aspects to this kind of thing. But, Jay would be very much within his rights to ask, why should I still have a felony conviction on my record for a crime that the state of Maryland now says did not occur, at least in the way that they themselves put it forward at trial?
Yeah. I've been for the last couple of months trying to spark off the Justice for Jay Wilds movement, but so far it's not going anywhere. so, um, so, so I guess where our difference is that I see this as another example of what I'd call the innocence fraud phenomenon, where it works on two parts. For one, the entertainment. So there's always some kind of media created, whether it's a podcast or a documentary, that's very one-sided, that leaves out a lot of evidence, that kicks off a campaign for a convicted killer, and then they put so much pressure on our courts that eventually they get results. Like you mentioned the West Memphis Three before, Ryan Ferguson. I mean, and then of course there's an incentive for these lawyers to work for this, because then they sue in the civil courts for multi-million dollar judgments. And it's just really shocking when you, like, I went into like a deep dive on Adnan Syed's fellow formerly convicted killer professor at Georgetown, Marty Tankleff's case, and I went through all the documents I could find in that, and here he is being released on a technicality. They're saying his release should not be looked at as a sign of innocence. He does not deserve any money. And what does he do next? He goes and sues everyone and gets millions of taxpayer money. So why is this? Why do you see this as something different than part of a larger kind of wave of innocence fraud?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I try to avoid excessively inflammatory language when I talk about these things, especially in print. Of course, on a podcast I'll get a little bit more juicy. And I think
I hope so.
my perspective is the defense lawyers in these cases are generally just doing their job. They are there America has an adversarial prosecution versus defense system, where defense lawyers, when I was a defense lawyer, I would absolutely try to convince people to believe in the best version of my client's case possible. And I was just doing my job. It's a noble profession. All of our founding fathers were criminal defense lawyers who defended murderers. Abraham Lincoln was too. But the key thing, so I put my focus more on journalists. Journalists should understand that defense lawyers, just as much as prosecutors, have an agenda. But when it comes to like lawsuits for wrongful convictions, that gets into a whole other series. Of course, these are also lawyers. These are plaintiffs' lawyers. They're civil law plaintiffs' lawyers, and what they're looking for is a payout, is a judgment. And so what they do is they sort of piggyback on alleged or true wrongful conviction cases. And then when the person gets released from jail, they will file a civil lawsuit against the law enforcement agency. And they almost never win these cases. It's very hard to actually win these cases because of something called qualified immunity. But they can drag cities into years-long litigation. And the city has to pay its own lawyers $200 an hour, over years. And so cities will just pay out these judgments, regardless of whether it's genuinely a truly wrongful conviction or not. They just want to make it go away. That's why, and I think here's a tip. There's a law firm in Baltimore that is now specializing in representing police officers who have been accused of misconduct, and they have actually gotten some serious judgments about bogus wrongful conviction claims. So, some guy gets released by Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore, the progressive prosecutor, and then they sue in civil court and they say, "Oh, I was framed by the Baltimore cops, etc. And Marilyn Mosby released me. So how can I be guilty?" And then this law firm specializes in looking very hard at these alleged wrongful conviction cases. and finding out that in 2 of the cases, they found out that the actual guy who was supposedly wrongfully convicted fabricated the evidence that led to his release.
Oh, are
One,
you talking about the case in New York, or is this Baltimore?
no, these are 2 Baltimore cases.
Oh, because
David
there's a New York
Simon.
case I was looking at just like this. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
funny.
there's another. I think there
Queen's
are
case just
several
like
of these
this.
now.
Yeah,
Yeah. And so, like,
Bellamy.
federal judges in Baltimore in these 2 cases said, you're not getting a penny because you faked the evidence that led Marilyn Mosby to release you. David Simon mentioned 2 of these cases. So there's a little bit of a back. So now there's like lawyers making money on both sides. Most of them are making money on the wrongfully convicted guy's side, but some of them are making money representing
It's
police.
not. I would say that is one for. I just see so many of these same lawyers, Jennifer Bonjean, Kathleen Zellner, go from case to case to case to
Oh,
case
yeah,
of
yeah.
wrongful conviction. And I interviewed. It was really interesting interview the defense attorney for one of these wrongful conviction movements. I don't know. I'd call them, and this you'd call this inflammatory language, but this is the way I talk. Okay, I'm very honest. Pet killer, Julius Jones, Paul House killer, had a big campaign. He was on death row. With that, always, because there's so many people who are against the death penalty. This is in Oklahoma. So I interviewed David McKenzie, who was Julius Jones's attorney, and he was amazed by the lack of ethics of the Innocence Project lawyers that took over that case. And what he said in that interview is, I advocated, I just was trying to save Julius Jones's life. I advocated to, the fullest extent that I could, but this is another level. This is he goes, in my advocacy, I could not, you can't lie, cheat, and steal. And that's the way he describes the Innocence Project lawyers. So are you not seeing an element of lawlessness in the way that the amount of they have the money, they have the power, and they seem to push it through? No?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the Innocence Project, the one thing that's happened is that it's like grown and metastasized. So it used to be in the mid 1990s. I still know a lot of Innocence Project lawyers from the original gangster times in the mid 1990s. And back then, it was a sort of, a neglected and despised group of true believer leftist weirdos who are coming and, causing a bunch of problems and requesting DNA testing when our state's laws don't allow it, etc. And, it was a very pure movement by people who really believed in the cause and were very careful to consider all of the evidence before and against the client before they took on a case. And they were very successful in the early days precisely because they were often able to get compelling DNA proof that really proved innocence. But, I would say since maybe like 2010 or so, with this huge move toward true crime and all the attention and all the publicity, first of all, it's hard to even tell who's real Innocence Project and not anymore. Because, Jason Baldwin of the West Memphis Three started his own project. And, David Protess of the Anthony Porter case started his own project. And Innocence Project isn't like a copyrighted name. Anybody can use it. And I would say that, yeah, they're in this general big community of so-called innocence projects. There are a lot of grifters and they do a lot of harm.
Okay.
But at the other, sort of dynamic that is very sensitive about these cases is you will have, a local lawyer in a place like, Little Rock, Arkansas, or Waxahachie, Texas, or Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and they do their best to defend a client. Maybe they don't. Sometimes they just totally screw up. I've had cases like that. But, they'll do their best using their means and their intelligence and their education and their commitment to try to defend a client, and the client gets convicted and sentenced to death row. Then the client's case becomes sort of, a media spectacle, or, there are articles written that get people's attention. And then, I grew up in Houston, Texas, and we would call them carpetbaggers, from the Civil War era. And then what you have is you have lawyers, let's say from Los Angeles or New York City or Washington, D.C. or Chicago, and they come to these smaller towns in the South, and they have fancy degrees from big schools, and they've got, often they work for, billionaire law firms, and they make $500,000 a year. And this is one of their pro bono projects. And then you have this sort of fascinating social divide between the respected local criminal defense lawyer who went to a good state school, got a solid education, and then you've got all these Hollywood producers and, big law lawyers doing their 2 weeks of pro bono per year, descending on this town, and then saying everything the local lawyer did was crappy, and he missed all these issues, and didn't find out all these important facts. Sometimes the carpetbaggers are right, but often they don't really understand the dynamics of where they're going, and they don't understand how people think in these communities. And that also, that's also a factor in cases that become big, media focused cases. You will get famous lawyers, millionaire lawyers with lots of support coming to these smaller towns and simply assuming that the system here can't possibly work because it doesn't work like it does in, LA or New York courtrooms. And sometimes the carpetbaggers are right, but I think, a lot of the times they just gin up extraneous issues that don't really shed any light.
So, so you write in this as really you make a good point that our justice system generally works a lot better than it's represented in the media, certainly, and yet there's all these innocence clinics. You worked for the U of Texas Capital Punishment Clinic, so that's in a state that obviously wants capital punishment. Do you feel that these clinics are needed in addition to these kind of, the Innocence Project is still needed, and all these kind of, I would say just the movement to free juveniles, and I guess a better way to describe it is to end life sentences for juveniles is a billion-dollar movement. So I would call this probably a multi-billion-dollar movement. Do you think it's needed still, if these cases were so good in the 90s?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the quality of cases have dropped off. As I said in another interview, the low-hanging fruit of the Innocence Project or the Innocence movement was largely picked. So, I mean, if you've got a conviction from the late 70s in which it's only a couple of eyewitnesses and a jailhouse snitch, there's no video evidence, there's no DNA, etc., that leaves a lot of room for dispute, and many of those cases have been justly overturned. But frankly, a lot of these, clinics and projects are, the demand for innocent people is outstripping the supply. And there's just not enough of them out there to provide. I wouldn't call it a billion-dollar industry because, and it's also not an industry. They don't have like, they don't have a chamber of commerce or something. It's basically law professors making 120, 150 grand a year, which I would love to make. But now, they're looking at cases that came, that were actually convictions in the late 90s and early 2000s. And police are much more responsible now than they were back in the 70s and 80s because they know they have much more scrutiny. I think they were probably doing honest jobs in the 70s and 80s too, except for some bad apples. But now, with body cams, with DNA, with video cams, with people videotaping police constantly, genuine severe police misconduct has become a lot less prevalent, especially since most interviews are now recorded on videotape, so anybody can see what the police are doing. And so a lot of the cases that are taken up in these clinics, I just don't think have much merit. And in fact, they lose very often before the courts because
I'd say they
And
lose, but they never give up. They can
yeah,
lose a
I mean,
couple
they
times,
lose and
right?
then they
Look at
still,
Adnan Syed. He lost in the Supreme Court, and he still got himself. They still got him out. So
exactly. And I
it's
mean, because his case became famous, and it got a lot of hangers on and a lot of lawyers who wanted, publicity and who wanted a feather in their cap, which we all do, and
a
lawyers
feather in
do it
their
too.
cap and a lot of money too. There's so much money on the entertainment side, on Rabia selling her book, on the he's guilty side. I will tell you, there's no love. You're treated like a pariah, a social pariah, and there's no money in it. The people that
Exactly.
do it,
Yeah.
like me and Martin Pride and a few other people talking about this phenomenon, we do it because it's important to us, and we think it's immoral and wrong. But that's why we speak out about it. But one of the other things I wanted to ask you, hold on one second. You write in this. Yeah. Okay. You write Adnan Syed landed in this unique situation because he is a world famous celebrity, and he became a world famous celebrity because of a humble podcast. Is femicide a unique situation? And would you just and why did you use the word humble to describe Serial?
Well, I guess because, Serial is the kind of podcast that's just listened to by NPR members, by people who listen to NPR. And so, the number, I enjoy NPR. I enjoy This American Life, some more than others. And it started out as just a branch of This American Life. And how many people listened to This American Life in 2014? Probably like maybe 1 or 2 million in a
Mhm.
nation of 330 million people. And it's still that way. I mean, who listens to This American Life now? Not very many people. And the production values were okay, but not great. And nobody, absolutely nobody, thought that Serial was going to become this giant worldwide sensation. All of the later series of Serial, when the New York Times bought it, maybe 3 or 4 million people listened to them at the very most. And so it was humble at the beginning. It did turn into a giant phenomenon.
So what this is my last question, then we'll go through. You have I think at least one question in the super chats for you. So Colello was someone on death row that you worked out a deal with, with the state, and you got him time served after 20 years. And after his release, my understanding is that he broke probation and he was rearrested. What was that like when you heard that news for you as his lawyer?
Oh, I didn't even pay attention to it, frankly,
Okay.
because basically we worked out the deal in 2003, with very hard-headed attorneys from the state of Texas who were defending his conviction. And at that time, I was assisted by a lawyer, an oil and gas lawyer from Texas, great guy. And we worked out the deal. It wasn't time served. He had to serve another, I
Oh,
think,
right.
eight
You're right.
years.
Yes. Till
Yeah, I think he had to serve another
2013.
8 years
Yeah.
in prison. Sure. And basically, I got along pretty well with Paul. And we did a lot of work on his case. And we were just about the federal judge, who was a Republican conservative Regan appointee, was just about to order an evidentiary hearing in his appeals. And we had submitted about a 240-page long motion with about 80 exhibits demonstrating what we felt to be profound problems with his conviction and sentence. And then the state of Texas contacted us and said, we don't want to go through with this hearing, and let's see if we can work out a deal. And then I can't really go into the details of the negotiations, but we did work out that deal. And after that, shortly after that, I basically left and went to Germany and became a law professor. I don't really come up with keep contact with my former clients that much because I view that well, because some of them are dead, of course, and I'm not the kind of lawyer who thinks I'm a friend of my clients. Some of my clients I have sympathy for, some of them former clients I think are, quite sinister people. I do my job like a surgeon does his job for somebody on the operating table, because death row clients are in danger of their lives, and your role as a defense attorney is to save them. So I didn't actually keep up with whatever Colella has done. I'm sure he's probably gotten back into trouble with the law, and I'm sure he's probably suffering for it. And then probably, he probably got out, then he probably went back in, probably got out, probably went back in. That's how
Okay.
people who are in the, who live in the twilight criminal underworld live, halfway between law-abiding and criminal. And they go in and out of prison, and they miss court dates, and they get, violated, and they have to go, it's fairly
Yeah.
typical stuff.
So I have some questions for you. So from KB has a statement, and then she has a question. So first, her statement. Thank you, KB, for the $10 super chat. I don't see how Hae Min Lee wasn't deliberately diminished in Serial. Quote, Hae liked Sprite, unquote, was about all Sarah Koenig gave her. Care to comment?
Yeah, and that goes back to something we were talking about beforehand, which is that, when journalists come to a supposed wrongful conviction case, they don't care about the victims, because frankly, that's not where the new action is. The victims are not there to give you a telephone interview. The victims are not there to tell you their side of the story. And, they are just, in the ground because of what the defendant did. And that is something that I think journalists should really pay more attention to. At the very least, I think journalists should make a sincere and sustained effort to get a full picture of the person who was killed before their audience. Now a journalist and a lawyer would say, we're just interested in the facts, and that's all we want to do. But the thing is, what journalists and lawyers don't realize is that, the people who are listening to this are just ordinary people. And the first thing they're going to think about is what a horrible, tragic injustice and shame it is that this life was snuffed out. And I think that, the journalists would say, well, they can't tell us anything more, and the victims' families will only say they're sad. And that's, to me, that's a bit cynical.
I don't know. Yeah, that is cynical, right? Yeah, no, they have a lot to say. I've talked to quite a few families of the victims in different cases. KB also wants to ask you, thank you for again, another $10 super chat. Thank you very much, KB. Does Mr. Hammel think an inquisitorial criminal justice system like Germany is more ethical, or, I don't need Salbarilli? How do you pronounce that? Let me put it on the screen so you can read it, Andrew. Hold on.
Salubrious.
I don't even know what that means. Can you tell me?
Yeah, it means sort of like healthy. I wonder if this person's a native English speaker, because salubrious is quite an interesting word. Salubrious means sort of healthy and positive and correct. And also just to go back to KB's point, I'll go back. I'll come to her current question, or his current question. But one thing that I would also like to see, frankly, I would like to see an honest and in-depth documentary about the harm and the trauma that victims' family members have to suffer when one of their relatives is murdered. I think that with compassion and good storytelling and thoughtful narrative, you could make a great, deeply moving, compassionate documentary about the enormous harm that these crimes do to families.
Have you seen Dear Zachary, that documentary? That would be a good
yes, I
example
have.
of that.
Yeah. And I thought that was
moving.
a step in the right direction. That's also one of the reasons that I really admire David Simon, is he takes that perspective seriously too in many of his creations. And I think that that documentary is not going to make the problem is that documentary is not going to make a huge amount of money because it will be a private, personal, intimate, deeply disturbing documentary about questions we don't have good answers to and about trauma that ordinary people have to cope with. And that's nowhere near as sexy as this innocent guy got released from prison. But these are stories worthy of being told too. And I think more people should be concentrated on telling them. And so now to get to the latest question, I've studied the German criminal justice system in depth and written about it. And it's the German system provides basically the same rights as the American system. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to a neutral judge. You have the right to appeals, etc. So it is a fair and modern and responsible criminal justice system that usually gets the right people. And what I would say is also that Germans are very obsessed with the American criminal justice system going wrong and putting the wrong people behind bars. But they know almost nothing about their own criminal justice system. So the German system has flaws. First of all, you don't have to record interrogations. You just have a cop summarize them. And a judge alone makes the decision whether you are innocent or guilty, except for very, very, very serious cases. But even then, you have only 2 jurors. So, different countries have different criminal justice systems. But I would say the American criminal justice system works very well in terms of finding out who committed the crime and putting them behind prison. And the German system does a very good job of that too. But they both have flaws. And as an American, I think we should try to correct the flaws in the American system. And I urge Germans to think about and correct the flaws in their system. Excuse me. Hello?
I'm sorry. Yes, finally, did the Italian justice system railroad Amanda Knox?
Initially, yes, but at the end, they corrected their initial mistake and reached the correct result.
All right.
That's my view.
All right. That's your view. Okay. I have to come, maybe have you back. We can talk about that sometimes. Andrew Hammel, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your time discussing this with me. The article is linked in the description. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great week.
Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks.